Restoring your Windows PC with USB sticks. In the past there used to be different USB sticks. These were called CDs or DVDs, but now there aren't anymore. And also many notebooks these days and many computers these days don't even have disk inserts anymore. Therefore you have to rely on the one thing that is left, SD cards and USB sticks. And since USB sticks is the one thing that is more common, I have made a few in order to restore my notebook once it gets back from the repair. Therefore, this is all up to date, and therefore I also think it makes sense to at least discuss what I have come up with so far. First of all, in order to understand how something like this works, I'm trying to explain it to you. First of all, if you have a virus, and if the virus is not the corona or COVID virus, but instead a digital one, then the potential problem is this. If this phone here is your PC, then the virus is stored potentially on this hard drive. So therefore now, wouldn't it be nice if you could reset the whole thing without the data on this thing? So therefore the problem is you cannot have an operating system on here because the operating system is also stored somewhere and this could also be infected. Therefore you need something else. You need another storage device that then connects to this device and is able to run software that is able to run without the storage on this device. And this is what a recovery stick or DVD is, or a recovery medium, you could also say. So now, let's say your PC is infected. The first thing you could potentially do is you could reset your PC within Windows, for example. But again, this only has the problem, or this only has the one thing it cannot do is it cannot reinstall the system from itself. It's a bootstrap paradox. Therefore, you need something else. You cannot pull yourself up with your own hand because you're connected, basically. And that's the whole problem. So therefore, you need something external. Now, there are several options now I want to discuss. First of all, in terms of backing files up or in terms of backing a system up, what is the difference? Files are the things like images, like videos, like I don't know, a Word document, an Excel document. A song, for example, in the MP3 is also a file. These files can be backed up by basically you copying them to a hard drive. This also can be automated by programs that do this automatically and continuously for you, such as, I don't know, what I'm using is SyncBack Drive, which is a free program. But wouldn't it then be also nice if you didn't just store the things you want to store to a local hard drive, because if your house burns down, then you also might have a potential problem. But even additionally, potentially to a cloud. So the benefit of a cloud is obviously that it is kind of independent. Even if a single data center breaks down, there are still other options because the data is actually usually spread among many data centers. At least to my understanding of this whole situation. So therefore, ideally for a backup, you have the original one, you have a local backup, and you have a cloud backup. So now, when it comes to restoring the whole thing, OneDrive, for example, Microsoft's cloud service only backs up the files, but not the settings. Because the main problem if you only back up the files is what happens if you have, for example, a program which has settings. Let's say your email program. You're already logged in with your account. It is already accustomed to you. You already had a few settings. And this is only one program. Most people have dozens, maybe hundreds of programs on their smartphones and on their notebooks. So therefore, the idea, or the question comes up, what if I could just take something like my phone, then just back it up completely, and then have a new phone, or the old phone that is then reset or repaired, and then just inject the whole thing into the new phone, and it would be the identical phone, basically. Of course, it is not identical, but in terms of the software, it would be identical. Because setting up phones and notebooks takes time. Days, potentially. Maybe weeks. And since your work week probably has some value and you don't want to spend the next few nights or the next few nights of the next few weeks setting up your PC again, if there is also another solution that could just do it for you, the idea of the image backup was created. An image is basically the thing we just described. On smartphones, there is something on Galaxy phones, for example, that is called a smart switch, which tries to do something like an image, but it is not really. And on Windows, there is something from Windows, which is called Windows Recovery, I guess. Now, in terms of Windows, there are two different editions again. There is the one for the image backup that backs up the whole system with all the settings. Of course, you could also back up the whole system with all the settings, but without the files, if you already stored the files somewhere else. But I think it would make sense to restore just the whole system. Nowadays, maybe not so much anymore, because let's say, for example, I have my notebook, I sent it to repair, which is actually the case, and now I, in the meantime, have access to OneDrive and can actually edit files. If I now reset the whole thing with the image that was created when I sent the notebook in, I have the problem of potential synchronization issues between the two, between the cloud files from OneDrive and also the drives, not the drives, but the files that are then locally stored or restored with the image I created. In Windows, there are these two options. The first one is the image option. I tried this in the past and it failed dramatically. So I also sent in my notebook for repair, because that's something I do for a hobby, send notebooks in for repairs. And what I then tried to do is just restore it. It didn't work, it didn't work, and it didn't work. And I was mildly frustrated. So therefore, what I then decided to do was maybe not trust Windows anymore and to go to a third party instead. This third party is called Acronis True Image, and it's apparently one of the leading, at least according to a blog page I looked up a few days ago, because I didn't really know if Acronis Image 2019 would be something I should still trust with saving me basically 2 weeks of work recreating and installing my notebook again. So therefore, what I did is I created all these different recovery sticks, some from Acronis and some from Windows. So in terms of Windows, there is also, of course, no, not of course. So there is an option, as I just described, to copy basically your whole system and potentially reinstall it. But there is also something else, which is the normal recovery, which is the system recovery. So basically think of it as the potential to reinstall Windows without redoing all of your files. Actually, within Windows, there are these two options. You can either reset the PC and keep the files, or reset the PC, basically reinstalling Windows, but also delete the drive, so the files. So now, you can do this internally with Windows, but then again, the bootstrap paradox if you have a virus, and also if you reset the entire PC. So therefore, what I have now created is, first of all, a USB stick that has Windows Recovery that was created with the Windows Recovery Media Creation Tool. So it's called Media Recovery Media Tool or something like this. And this was created on my old Lenovo IdeaPad. I couldn't update it. I mean, I could potentially update it, but I mean, I don't use USB sticks anymore, so therefore I just have it still on there, and it probably is still working and would potentially reinstall Windows 8 to any PC I give it to. So now, in order for you to understand this even, here's how it works. If you have a Windows device, which this is not, but this is just the example I use, then what you can do is you can say to the device, don't run on your internal software, but run on your external software I plug into you. And this is the basic foundation for basically installing something from an external device like a USB stick. So what you do is, whenever you start up, in the BIOS you can change the booting order. So this means you, instead of checking, so the BIOS basically checks for the internal file that starts up the system. And what you can instead say, don't look on the internal file, not the internal file, but the internal drive, but instead look on an external drive, basically on the ports, if there is something that you can run, and if so, then run it. And that's the basis for this whole adventure. So that's the first stick I have. I could potentially install Windows 8. So this is just for the system itself, a stick that recovers the system outside of the borders of its own skin. The next thing I have is the newer version of this, because I again had to send in my notebook. I wanted to be sure that it is the best and the newest version. A potential benefit to this is that it has both USB-A and USB-C. And since my notebook, at least the notebook I had until recently, has 2 USB-C ports and 1 USB-A port, the potential problem you run in, and also I would potentially run in, is what if I now want to connect also an image, because an image is something that's very large and doesn't fit on here. So therefore, if you create an image, you need an external hard drive that actually stores the image. This only is basically the software that then accesses the files, or the file, the big file maybe, depending on the format the program uses, to access the files and then restores them from this drive to your PC. So this is your operating system, these are your files, and then you restore them to your PC. So therefore, the potential problem is if you plug in something like this, and when it comes to restoring something, I think it makes sense to not rely on a third-party hub, but instead to, at least if possible, use the internal native ports that are built in. When it comes to now my notebook, what I can use is the USB-A for this. But if I use the USB-A for this, then I have to find a different solution for my hard drive, where the files are actually stored on. And I could potentially use USB-A again. No, I cannot. So therefore, I have now 2 options. The first option is to use USB-C on this, but also, because I don't only have these USB sticks, and this is only the Windows recovery stick, but what I instead also thought about is what if I convert my drives to USB-C? And this is what I did basically 1 or 2 years ago. I said, instead of having this other USB-B connector here, I just want a USB-C connector here. And there were only a few drives available, and these drives aren't that good, and it was a little bit of a compromise. But what I now have is a USB-C drive that I can also connect with USB-C. But also there's an adapter, so I can potentially also use it just with a normal USB-A hub, or connect it with USB-A to my notebook. The next thing we now have is something that is kind of a leftover, since my HP Spectra is from HP, Hewlett-Packard. There was also an option on there. So the company has a program which is called HP Assistant, and this also offered a recovery stick option. So I made one recovery stick basically 2 years ago, I think. And I don't know if this just disguises as the HP recovery program, whereas in reality it just creates a Windows bootable stick with the normal program, that is the program I used for the other one, and also for the newer one, which you can also use if you have, I guess, at least an activated version of Windows on your computer. And then you can just create one of these sticks. So therefore I still have this as a backup, but this will probably also restore to an old version of Windows 10. Now, additionally, this is only regarding the recovery, not the recovery, but the OS. So it restores Windows, but it doesn't restore the files. So what I now need is a program, as I said already, Acronis, that also restores my files. And since not only the files, but the whole, it wants to restore the whole computer. It's not only a reinstallation of the operating system, but also it is basically just this one stick you can insert, and it basically amps up your phone. And therefore this also needs to have a drive it runs on. Basically it's the same concept, it's just with a different program. Instead of it running Windows for the computer and only accessing the hardware of the computer, it now runs Acronis, a version of Acronis, so basically the program I use. Therefore I needed to create 2 sticks, and the second stick is something that is an additional option you actually potentially would need. The first one is just the normal program. So what you need now is you insert this into your notebook. Then you boot up your notebook. And then after you change the BIOS settings to check if here is something you can boot up, and then boot it up, and then Acronis image runs on your computer, even though your computer could also have just no operating system at all. This, by the way, is also how you can create a very lean PC that is also very secure with basically running your entire PC just from a stick. So basically the operating system is on here. You could potentially store also a few files on here or in the cloud, and you would only use the PC's hardware to run the software, that is the OS, maybe a Windows installation, maybe a Linux installation, to then run it. And then you can just deplug it and you don't have any data stored on the PC itself, which is nice, I guess. So now I have the stick, and if I insert the stick, I simultaneously then also need to insert my drive where the actual image is stored, because here we don't have the actual image stored. The image, if you think about a computer, if you have all the files on there and all the programs and all the settings, mine has 2 terabytes in total of internal SSD, and I usually try to keep it at 1 terabyte in order for not the backups and also the images to be very big. So therefore, what I now have is a very big file that is potentially 1 terabyte or split into many smaller files, created by Acronis True Image 2019. So now, what I need to do is I need to connect this, and I need to connect this, and then ideally I wait for, I don't know how long it takes, and then ideally I have my Windows PC restored again. But this only works if the PC is similar to the one before, maybe identical, maybe it's the identical PC actually, and it just doesn't have the data on there anymore. Because the problem is, what about all the different drivers, for example? Each single PC might have slightly different drivers, might have a slightly different version of a program. And so the problem is, if you now have a new notebook, a new laptop, how to restore the old thing? Let's just say you switch from an older phone to a newer phone. How do you make these two things compatible? Very conveniently, Acronis has already thought of this. At least I think they have, because I'm not entirely sure, but I nevertheless created Acronis Universal Restore Medium. So basically this is now a second step. The first one is to try to recreate your PC using these two things, and then as an additional step you do this one, and this potentially fixes the driver issues and all the other issues that come up if you don't have the same exact processor, if you don't have the same hardware, if the number of ports is different, and so on and so on. So in total, you could say you need at least one drive, which is then only a local drive. What I therefore also have is a backup in the cloud with one drive. What I also have is Backblaze, which is an additional service that backs up your internal hard drive, but also your external hard drives, and it just backs them all up into the cloud. And whenever you now lose your hard drives, what you can actually do is just order your drives from the service. You can also, I think, send the hard drive then back, and this gives you a refund because you need to actually pay for the hard drive. Or you can download a very big zip file, think of maybe all the hard drives you have, and then downloading a 16 terabyte zip file. Where do you actually download it to? That's a question I ask myself. But of course you can potentially also just download one zip file for every single drive and then just unpack it on the drive, so therefore you wouldn't have additional storage. But I think for a zip file to be unpacked, you actually need twice the storage of the zip file, because the files have to be created and still the original thing also still is there. So therefore it first has to be created as a duplicate, and then you can delete the zip file. But this also is a potential problem. So therefore maybe ordering the hard drives might make more sense. But what I have it mainly for is, if my house burns down, or my apartment burns down rather, then I would have an option to just get all the drives, basically just directly from this service. In total now I have 6 sticks, 2 Windows, so 3 actually are basically Windows installation sticks that would potentially install Windows. One of them is the one I would actually use, then I have the HP Assistant backup one, and then I have the very old one from my IdeaPad. What I also have is the Acronis normal one and the Acronis universal one. And I even have an additional stick, but that's actually not really important, because there is not a recovery thing stored on there.